Magandang aldaw po sa Indo Gabos, sa Satuya Gabos. And first of all, I would like to thank the Most Reverend Rex Andrew Clement Alarcon, our Archbishop, for this invitation to participate in the lecture series on the occasion of the centennial of the canonical coronation of what we all know as Our Lady of Peñafrancia. Many thanks also to the Ateneo de Naga University Press, led by its director, Christian Cordero, for this invitation. But I have to say that I'm very sorry that I cannot be physically present to deliver this lecture, but I hope that even through this lecture via Zoom, may maguguno man po tabi ka muna maski kadikit. So let me begin my talk because it's a bit long. Pinagandaan ko po talaga ini. Okay. The Nuestra Señora de Peñafrancia is very unusual on several counts. Until recently, the shrine where the image was venerated was not a parish church. In fact, it was located in the outskirts of an already existing parish. The devotion to Peñafrancia was also peculiar in not being sponsored by a religious order. Other famous religious devotions, such as that of the Santo Niño and the Black Nazarene, were administered by religious orders, specifically the Augustinians for the Santo Niño and the Recollects for the Black Nazarene, at least until 1896. Despite being located in the margins and not having the powerful organization of a religious order behind it, the Virgin of Peñafrancia emerged out of obscurity to become Patrona del Bicol, the patron of an entire region long before regions were formally created by the Philippine government in the 1970s. And Bicol probably is the only regional entity, however defined, to have a Catholic icon as a focal point. How did this happen? This paper seeks to provide an answer to the evolution of what I consider as an indigenous devotion, and it is based on a critical analysis of historical sources, and in the process gesturing toward key issues within the church, in local culture, and in the devotion's social and historical embeddedness. Okay, so first, to reconstruct the origins of the devotion to the Virgin of Peñafrancia, we need to reimagine a totally different world in the early 1700s. As one historian famously titled his book, "The Past is a Foreign Country." We have to imagine dense forests that separated the old capital of Nueva Caceres, the area of San Francisco Church, all the way to the cathedral. Imagine beyond that would be dense forest all the way to what is now the shrine of Peñafrancia. And there was probably no road that connected these places, although perhaps there was a trail that ran parallel to the river, and this was something that people could tread on. Now, everyone in this room, I suppose, knows the stories about the Frenchman and former monk Simon Roland, better known as Simon Vela in Europe. And here on the screen, you can see Simon Vela with a halo on top. And you are also familiar with the Cavite-born Creole Bachiller Don Miguel Robles de Covarrubias in Las Islas Filipinas, who is referred to here simply as Miguel. Simon is credited with responding to the call and finding the statue of the Virgin de Peñafrancia under a rock on a hill in the Salamanca region of Spain in the early 1400s. And that's what you see in the painting. While Miguel is credited with introducing the devotion to Nueva Caceres in the early 1700s, with its main location being in what was known as a visita, literally to visit, in a visita that eventually became a barrio that today we know colloquially as Francia. Salamanca involve a tale of discovery, consistent with most apparitions of Mary in the late medieval and Renaissance period, while Nueva Cáceres involved the creation of a statue impliedly under a supernatural direction that moved through the life of Miguel. I shall not rehearse that story for you, for I assume that you are all familiar with it, except to underline the fact that from the outset, the devotion was not an instant hit. We did due through a critical reading of Gainza's text, despite all the miracles with which hagiography abounds. For the first century and a half, roughly, after its introduction, there were very few devotees. The Virgin of Peñafrancia was quite insignificant. It was peripheral. What did it mean for the Virgin of Peñafrancia to be peripheral? We have a number of points to discuss. First, it meant that it had no history, as long as it was peripheral. The Dominican Bishop Francisco Gainza had expressed interest in the devotion even while he was still in Manila before he assumed his post as bishop. When he reached Nueva Cáceres in late 1862, he asked around for the origins of the Peñafrancia devotion. Alas, not a single member of the clergy could tell him about it. Did he ask ordinary folks? Perhaps unlikely. Gainza was known to have had a low view of indigenous culture. So he probably asked only the educated members of the clergy. Although he said that he asked both priests and non-priests. As Francis Tordilla puts it, the whole local community was silenced in Gainza's failure to gather some ethnographic notes from the people. If we take Gainza's claim at face value, it would appear that after a century and a half, 1710, no one knew the beginnings of Peñafrancia. It was a devotion without history, or as Eric Wolf would put it, a people without a history, truly marginal, not worth finding out. Peñafrancia, however, had a written history, which became the basis of Gainza's account published in 1867, and where this figure of the image is found. You can notice how simple the image is based on this engraving. Now, this story was actually tucked away in a corner of Spain and was unknown in the Philippines. Miguel's report from Nueva Cáceres, for Miguel wrote a report and 3 letters to Salamanca. These reports were appended as the very last entry in this book of Domingo Caballero, Historia de la admirable invención y milagros de la thaumaturga imagen de Nuestra Señora de la Peña de Francia, published in Salamanca in 1728. This book chronicles the miracles attributed to the Virgin, mostly dealing with those in Spain. But the story about Nueva Cáceres was like an afterthought. It appears at the very end of all the accounts, and it appears just before the index. Pahabol. While the Spanish imperial world, therefore, within this imperial world, therefore, the Philippines was marginal, and it was very remote because it had to be accessed via Mexico, across the Atlantic and across the Pacific. That was the navigation route at that time. And within this remote archipelago, Nueva Cáceres was even more marginal, making the story about Peñafrancia all the more peripheral. And indeed, the mark of peripherality was the fact that whatever story there was to be told about Peñafrancia in Nueva Cáceres was to be found in the imperial center. The blame was not to be laid on the center, but on the periphery for being peripheral. Second point, it meant that its location was outside the local center. The chapel or ermita for the Virgin of Peñafrancia was probably a ramshackle structure, much like a neglected barangay hall in today's terminology. It was built in the Visita, some 2 kilometers away from the center of Nueva Caceres. It was an area outside of the church belts, the territory of the uncivilized and those outside the reach of the state. But the Visita was not extremely remote. Miguel stated that it could be reached on foot in about half an hour, and masses were said there in the ermita on Saturdays. That this ermita was built in the geographic periphery is explained by Miguel's claim that Cimarrones requested him to build a church in the area, and this request supposedly solved Miguel's problem of finding a location for the chapel he had promised to build for the Virgin. This claim has received widespread acceptance, but we ought to raise some questions. First of all, the story about the Cimarrones, Cimarrones meaning outlaws or fugitives, otherwise known as remontados, this story is quite fanciful, with nothing to suggest that it actually happened. The story was embellished later on by Vitaliano Gorospe, who claimed that the Cimarrones were Negritos or Aitas. However, there is no corroborating evidence for the fable about Cimarrones and their ethnicity. What made these resistors to Spanish colonial rule want to have a church? And if they did, they would cease to be Cimarrones. If they lived in the Visita of Peñafrancia, they would have also been at risk of retribution from other hard-headed Cimarrones. And note that the problem of the Cimarrones in the vicinity of Mount Isarog persisted until the late 19th century. Or perhaps there was indeed a group of people who made that request to Miguel, but they were not Cimarrones. In any event, the use of Cimarrones becomes a trope, a way of saying that the Spanish imperial goal of evangelization was advancing and conquering the remote hinterland. Secondly, when Miguel arrived in Nueva Caceres, he was assigned to a small curacy. Tinauan siya ni sarong kuratong sadang, according to Gaines' history, where he stayed for 6 months, after which he was assigned to become curate of Nueva Caceres. If he was so keen in fulfilling his vow to the Virgin, why did he not start the devotion in the small parish where he had been assigned? Why did he not do anything in those 6 months? Here, something peculiar or intriguing confronts us. Miguel's original vow was to build a stone chapel, ermitang kapo, for the Virgin of Peñafrancia, quote, on the bank of the Pasig River in the city of Manila. He planned to have a painting and sculpture made. But then the story goes that Dominican Bishop Andres Gonzalez called him to Nueva Caceres, where he was ordained into the priesthood, preventing him from fulfilling his promise. Miguel wanted to build the chapel in Manila because it was the colonial capital. The narrative states that when he was sent to Nueva Caceres, he realized he could not fulfill his original vow. So he asked the Virgin, presumably, for a replacement site. The location had to be Orog Karahay. In this exchange of locations, he seemed fixated on a riverbank site, such that his first assignment in what was probably an inland parish did not fulfill that scenario. Did Miguel walk along the banks of the Naga River until he reached that spot that seemed to him a suitable place for the ermita? Why beside a river? In Spain, there is no river flowing near the Peñafrancia, although Salamanca is located on the banks of the Tormes River. Where did Miguel get his idea of a river in sight for the chapel that he would build? Perhaps influenced by geography on this Creole who was raised in the port of Cavite? Perhaps influenced by the geography of Manila? I don't know, but in any event, the site that he found for the Visita of Peñafrancia was on a riverbank. That was what he wanted. And it was outside the local center. And here we have some maps. This is quite familiar, Plan de la Ciudad de Nueva Cáceres originally. But here, this image is quite interesting because this is around the 1800s, And here you can see at the very top, there is already the ermita of Francia, and then San Francisco and the cathedral. It was already significant by this time. Okay, third point, in being peripheral, it had to compete for its place in ecclesial affairs. The uncritical acceptance of the Summarones story usually ignores the fact that from the outset, this Marian devotion could not be accommodated in the main altar of the Cathedral of Nueva Caceres, which was already dedicated to Saint John the Evangelist. So even if Miguel became the cura of the cathedral parish, he could not simply dethrone Saint John. The new Marian devotion had to find its own home. But more than just a home, it needed patronage. In Salamanca, the devotion to the Nuestra Señora de Peñafrancia was and has been in the hands of the Dominicans. But in Nueva Cáceres, the Virgin of Peñafrancia was not the responsibility of any specific religious order. Miguel was a secular priest, a diocesan priest. There was no organization with the resources to care for Peñafrancia and to promote devotion to it. From Miguel onwards, and for the next century and a half, Peñafrancia relied on individual rather than institutional support. Not surprisingly, it languished for a very long period. There was no patron for an object that would become a patron. Number 4, to be peripheral meant that even its place in the periphery was unstable. Literally, the ermita would come and go. A simple shock made of gogun was constructed by Miguel in the early 1700s. There, he placed the little statue of the Virgin of Peñafrancia. However, at a later date, he said he went home to the colonial center of Manila for reasons unexplained. Evidently, Nueva Cáceres at that time was not a career-advancing path for a rare university-trained cleric like Bachiller Don Miguel. Perhaps a new concursos for an important Manila parish had opened, for which Miguel applied but failed, hence his return to Nueva Cáceres. In 1796, Bishop Domingo Collantes noted how Nueva Cáceres was the place where most priests who could have obtained advanced degree at Santo Tomas ended up, a career dead end as a curate of a small parish. More so, Nueva Cáceres was a poverty-stricken ecclesiastical district. It had no large capelanias and obras pias like Manila, with fewer opportunities to acquire revenue from both the curate's salary from the government, which was dependent on the size of the parish and the number of tributantes, and the derechos parroquiales, the fees known as arancel, from the performance of sacraments. So there was every reason for Miguel to want to leave rather than stay in Nueva Cáceres. However, after his return to Manila, as the story goes, he lost the sight of his left eye. Miguel returned to Nueva Cáceres and proceeded to build a stone chapel that he had promised. Immediately, the story goes, his eye was healed. And because the focus of the hagiography is the Virgin, Miguel's character can be flawed, which in turn provides the setting for the Virgin's miraculous response. From our perspective, however, what can be inferred from the story is the seeming lack of determination on the part of Miguel to stay in Nueva Cáceres to promote the devotion he had introduced, until circumstances compelled him to return and make good on his vow. Given the ebb and flow of ecclesial affairs, in 1735, the ermita that Miguel had built was torn down by order of secular Bishop Felipe Molina, apparently because he found it unsightly. He then sought to construct another chapel. But why tear down an existing chapel while a new one had not been completed? It was odd. In any case, Miguel's dream ermita was gone after about 25 years. As a result of the demolition of the chapel, the image of Nuestra Señora de Peñafrancia was brought to the cathedral. What is interesting, however, is that the statue of the Lady of the Rosary had to be kept in the sacristy because its place at the side altar was occupied by the Virgin of Peñafrancia. Why was it not the other way around, with the Peñafrancia kept in the sacristy? Both were devotions associated with the Dominicans. Was it to placate the devotees of Peñafrancia? But the devotion to it was so insignificant that Bishop Molina could omit it, could exclude it in the Tabla General de Fiestas, which he prepared in 1735, the same year as the chapel's demolition. Anyway, 6 years later, in 1741, a stone and mortar building was completed by Bishop Isidro Arevalo on the current site of the shrine. Arevalo was the nephew of Bishop Molina, and both belonged to the secular clergy. In 1863, after 120 years, Gainza arrived in Nueva Caceres to find that, quote, the church was being neglected all year round. In comparison to other chapels and pious sites elsewhere in Pampanga and Manila, the ermita of Peñafrancia in Nueva Caceres was never endowed. We hear of no family or wealthy individual bequeathing tracts of land to be held in mortmain by the church, the revenues of which would fund the maintenance of the shrine and its priest. Moreover, unlike La Naval, Nazareno, and Antipolo, Peñafrancia in Nueva Caceres did not have a cofradia, tasked with the regular oversight of its annual festivities. These cofradias had endowments in the forms of land. With no cofradias, there was no reliable source of revenue for the upkeep of Peñafrancia. In fact, it was only during Gainza's term that a priest, the Patangueño Dr. Vicente Garcia, who famously defended Rizal's novel, was assigned as chaplain of the shrine. Since the shrine was neither privately endowed nor a canonical parish entitled to government subsidy, Vicente Garcia, perhaps out of self-abasement and sacrifice and piety, quote-unquote, begged Nakimahira, Gainza, to make him chaplain of the shrine without pay. Thus, Garcia became the first chaplain, a post held from 1865 until 1878 with no remuneration. Number 5, it meant that it was immersed in pre-colonial religious beliefs and practices. As is well known, Miguel reported that the blood of a dog was needed to paint the statue. But after the dog was thrown to the river, it came back to life. This tale is incredulous, although the account stated that the miracle was witnessed by 3 Dominicans who were initially skeptical. But was dog's blood needed to darken the wood, as is often claimed? We need to remember that plant-based dyes were more commonly used because they were easily available and effective in creating durable and vibrant colors on wooden surfaces. Animal blood was not used to paint wood, but it could be used for offerings to spirits. It would appear that Miguel was not attuned to this aspect of indigenous culture, and perhaps the victim, a naive victim of what the artisan said. Oh, we need a dog's blood to paint the wood. But the point is that this is very unusual. Number 6. Well, before number 6, I still have to continue. The narrative, moreover, provides the impression that the Nuestra Señora de Peñafrancia was the one directing events, needing to be placated through compliance with the original vow in exchange for miraculous favors. A transaction, a bargain between Miguel and the Virgin seemingly ensued. Miguel was non-committal, but seemingly compelled to eventually find the river in sight and build a stone chapel. Otherwise, he would lose favor, get sick, and not recover. And when we read closely Gainza's account, there is no discourse of grace, with Peñafrancia portrayed as seemingly asserting her will like an indigenous deity needing appeasement. Point number 6, and this is the last, in terms of peripherality, it meant that it survived on a culture of improvisations. The establishment of the devotion, from building the small chapel made of local materials to the production of a three-dimensional statue of the Nuestra Señora de Peñafrancia with no basis other than a two-dimensional stampita or engraving, required a host of improvisations. The local artisan had to use his imagination in making the statue. Hence, we observe the following. The wooden statue in Nueva Caceres measures approximately 42 centimeters, excluding the base and the crown. And these are images after it was stolen and returned. And we see the wood, and it's a very small statue. It is much smaller compared with the statue in Salamanca, which stands at approximately 70 centimeters. Although this is based on the reconstructed statue after the original in Salamanca was stolen in 1872. Note that the artisan, and probably Miguel himself, had no idea about the size of the statue in Salamanca, which none of them had seen in person. Now, the statue in Salamanca obviously shows Mary holding the child Jesus, whereas in the version in Nueva Caceres, the child Jesus is diminutive, almost non-existent. Even the painting of the Virgin of Peñafrancia in Paco, which you find you see in the screen, which dates back to the 1690s and also attributed to Miguel, distinctly shows the child Jesus on Mary's lap. In the case of Nueva Caceres, the child was evidently not part of the original wooden sculpture, but seemingly appended or a removable part. Why would the statue in Nueva Caceres be so different from the image in Paco or the statue in Salamanca? And this is the image obtained from the internet of the statue in Salamanca. Because photography would be invented only in the early 19th century, the printed image of the Salamanca statue could also have been stylized to conform with prevailing norms and styles. In terms of adornment, we have no image of the original statue, but what can be said is that Miguel must have tried to approximate as close as possible the image that he had in the stampita. We don't have that image, but a 1645 engraving to the right, this is an engraving of the Salamanca statue, contained a manto, this aureole around the head and the rostrillo around the face. If this was the same image that Miguel possessed, he might have tried to duplicate it, but with limited funds, perhaps the adornment of the statue was very minimal indeed. But the point here is that the lithograph, the engraving, was a stylized form very different from the actual statue. In fact, the figuration of the Nuestra Señora de Peñafrancia, and here is another lithograph of Peñafrancia. The figuration of the Nuestra Señora de Peñafrancia was probably patterned after the highly popular Virgin of Antipolo, which was carved in Mexico, also dark, and brought to the Philippines in 1626. Now, what is consistent is the dark complexion of the statues in Salamanca, Nueva Caceres, as well as the Mexican Virgin of Antipolo. Miguel would have possessed the general knowledge that the Black Madonna was the common depiction of the Virgin Mary in medieval Spain, a style that reached Mexico and the Philippines. Now, given all of these improvisations, it can be argued that the artisan who crafted the statue of the Virgin of Peñafrancia in 1710, under Miguel's direction, created something new. It was not a copy of the original, because they had not seen the original, although the intention was there. The image bore the marks of peripherality and indigeneity, which made it distinctly local. Concomitantly, it could be positioned in a way that connected with the universal theme of Marian devotion. So we see in Peñafrancia this dual tension between the local and the universal. And the statues are really not the same. indexed by their names, which are alike but different. Peña de Francia and Peñafrancia. The de makes a difference. In this sense, Peñafrancia had always been indigenous while simultaneously coming from out there. However, the desire to seek legitimacy from the originary source in Salamanca has remained strong, such that despite the conspicuous differences between the two statues and their different histories and trajectories, there has been a pervasive tendency to regard the statue in Nueva Cáceres as, quote, a copy of the statue in Salamanca. Quote, a carbon copy, as Monsignor Florencio Iliana declared in 1949. However, in the same Coronation Silver Jubilee program, where Father Iliana's statement appeared, Domingo Abella asserted, quote, Our Lady of Peñafrancia was born on Bicol soil. So to speak, it is a native Bicol non. Tension between indigenous, local, and the foreign, universal. Now we go to the founding myth of Peñafrancia. How did Peñafrancia emerge out of its marginality and obscurity? The Dominican Bishop Francisco Gainza is widely credited with the consolidation of the devotion. He built a shrine that was completed in 1877, 2 years before his death. Gainza exercised zeal to promote the devotion to the Virgin of Peñafrancia and transform the earlier improvisations into tradition. Gainza's one lasting legacy was the consolidation of the history, or rather the hagiography, of the Virgin of Peñafrancia. And here is the cover. Frustrated in his attempts to obtain information and documentation from local sources, Gainza extracted the founding myth of the devotion in Bicolandia from Domingo Caballero's text published in 1728 in Salamanca, as we showed earlier, where we said the story of Nueva Cáceres was at the very tail end. Gainza then reproduced Caballero's chapter within Gainza's own chapter 8. It was a chapter within a chapter. And it did not present the Salamanca text in a way that would have made it obviously drawn from another published source. Gainza did not use quotation marks in the publication of this crucial history, which was not his. There were no visual cues that the text was actually a retelling of a previously published account. Was Gainza plagiarizing? He was an academic who had sterling credentials and who had a prolific publication list. Elsewhere in this 1867 publication, he cited and translated from sources exactly as a true academic like him would do, using quotation marks. We can conjecture that his suspension of all cares in citation was deliberate. In other words, Gainza wanted the text to be self-referential as a true origin story for Nueva Cáceres. Despite recounting the vagaries of his scholarly research into Peñafrancia and Nueva Cáceres in what was supposed to be a mere republication in 1867 of the 1728 Caballero text, Gainza seized the opportunity to invent a tradition for Peñafrancia in Nueva Cáceres as distinct from Salamanca, while simultaneously associating it with Simon Vela and Salamanca. In fact, the potency of the image and the narrative could leap from the Iberian Peninsula all the way to the Bicol Peninsula by means of the materiality of the book that he possessed, a book that contained an image of Peña de Francia that Miguel held close to his body, he said, to cure his illnesses. In a largely illiterate society, the printed book could indeed hold many amazing wonders. Yet, with this leap of magic and wonder, something new was created, deeply rooted in the context of Nueva Cáceres in the early 1700s. By taking this narrative and publishing it as the prelude to Grijalvo's novena, Gainza's history itself declared itself indispensable and inseparable from the local devotion to Peñafrancia. This novena that you can see on the screen, prepared by Bishop Grijalvo, appears at the second half of the same publication. At the first part, you find Gainza's history. As Father Tordilla reminds us, hagiography is different in method and objective from the modern science of history. Hagiography, according to Michel de Certeau, is intended for the edification of a group to which the hero or the saint, in this case the Virgin of Peñafrancia, is relevant. But Gainza was doing something much more interesting in 1867. He combined the fantastical feats of Peña de Francia, all of which happened centuries before 1867, with a contemporary history of the establishment of the new shrine for Peñafrancia in Nueva Caceres. In a sense, Gainza cleverly fused hagiography and history, inscribing both within a unified narrative. Bound together by religion rather than empty, homogeneous time, actual people alive at that time saw their names and deeds in the same narrative as Simon Vela in Salamanca and Don Miguel in Nueva Caceres from the previous centuries. The juxtaposition of the living and the dead in one religious time is a distinctive feature of the history pamphlet that Gainza published in 1867, appearing after the narrative, but before the novena, is what you see here on this page. Kasaysayan ka mga pira na ipinagtao sa pagkaparahay kang simbahan in Nuestra Señora de Peñafrancia, asin kang harongin sa iyang kapellan. Here was a new way of honoring devotees, especially elite devotees, such as Maria Imperial and Angel Rosales from Canaaman, who each donated 500 pesos, along with the Catholic Chinese Simon Tuangki, who donated 150 pesos. As the devotion became more established, it attracted more devotees and greater funds. Presented in the annual souvenir programs that listed the amount of the devotions, financial giving to Peñafrancia would become a status symbol quoted in religious fervor. But such donations were indispensable because there was no religious order or entity that sponsored or patronized the devotion to Peñafrancia. Because of the public nature of giving by elites, the Peña de Francia could not be privatized, as if it were the possession of a favored elite family. There was only one image, and it was the focal point for giving by individual elites. Here are further pages in this publication, ang mga nagpakakan kang mga ngaran, ang mga nagtao nin kahoy. Combined with the fact that the text was deliberately published in a variant of the Bicol language, Gainza's history signified the moment when the Peñafrancia solidified its originality, a trajectory distinct from its putative origin in the imperial center. This history, along with the novena, would be reproduced in chapbooks, which were sold to the faithful, who internalized the founding myth of Simon Vela and the return to life of the sacrificial dog. My own father retold these stories to me when I was a young boy, and he had a personal copy of this chapbook. Gainza's account would appear in capsule form in later annual souvenir programs, lending the devotion a foundational story that was a crucial factor in overcoming peripherality. From ecclesial control to the making of tradition. Gainza's initial intervention with the Virgin of Peñafrancia in Nueva Caceres began not in his bishopric, where he spent the last 16 years of his life, but in Manila, while he waited to journey to his new assignment. Even before he left Manila, Gainza had already heard of the Virgin's famous festivities, and from Manila he ordered the printing of the novenas. In the mid-19th century, therefore, devotion to the Virgin of Peñafrancia was beginning to acquire a reputation that reached beyond the borders of the Obispado de Nueva Caceres. Although Gainza complained about the state of the ermita when he saw it, by the time he succeeded in Nueva Caceres, the devotion to Nuestra Señora de Peñafrancia had already assumed some sort of prominence away from total marginalization. His predecessor in Nueva Caceres, the Augustinian Bishop Manuel Grijalvo, had in fact taken steps to give some semblance of stability to the devotion. In 1849, Bishop Grijalvo issued instructions for the recitation of the novena to the sweetest name of Mary, Mahamiso ng Ngaran ni Maria, which Grijalvo authored and Gainza reprinted in 1867. Previously, the entire novena was held in the ermita. However, in 1853, the exact date is on the screen, Grijalvo instituted the transfer of the image from the ermita to the cathedral for the first 7 days of the novena, from Friday to Thursday afternoon, when the image was then returned to the ermita for the novena of the remaining 2 days. The following Sunday was the feast day proper. What is interesting is why Grijalvo introduced this innovation. Here on the screen, we see that it says to accommodate the huge crowd of devotees. I am sorry to say that this is inaccurate. We have no other source but Gainza's statement. Alagad sa paghali nin mga maraot na kaugalian, to get rid of bad practices. We have no idea what these bad practices were, but we need to remember that at this time, the ermita had no chaplain and would not have one until 1865. Thus, the quote, bad practices could well be incursions of indigenous culture into devotional practices, perhaps even tolerated by some local clerics. The point is that the transfer of the image to the cathedral was instigated by the bishop's felt need to regulate and monitor the devotion. It was an act of ecclesiastical control over popular piety. Gainza himself decreed in 1864 that the entire novena should be held in the cathedral. Slightly over a decade after Grijalvo's institutional oversight over the devotion, Gainza explained that his order was due to the fact that the ermita was rather far and the church was small. There, it was Gainza, not Grijalvo. We have no estimate of the crowds in the 1860s, but we can take Gainza's report about the small size of the ermita at face value. But perhaps unsaid was the fact that Gainza did not like the ermita and the state it was in, which led him to build a new shrine. Gainza probably thought that the cathedral was a more fitting place for the novena, to which he personally attached great importance. Another major reason for Gainza's edict that moved the novenario to the cathedral was distance and accessibility. The ermita, he said, was haru-harayo, while the cathedral was conveniently a stone's throw away from his residence. With the novena held at the cathedral, there was no rough road to traverse for 9 consecutive days. Expediency for the head of the local ecclesiastical office was a strong reason to invent tradition. As a result of Gainza's decree, the Virgin of the Visita, which was otherwise ignored for the rest of the year, was now the one visiting and reigning in the main ecclesiastical center of Nueva Caceres. And this image is from the 1840s, and you can see here the river, and Peñafrancia shrine, or ermita, or capellan, is quite obvious. And on the bottom left is the cathedral. Despite the changing venue and date of the novena, the associated pageantry of this royal progress had been created. The traslación and the fluvial procession had been created by the mid-19th century, and for one glorious moment in the religious calendar, the periphery proved its conquest of the center. By the time of Gainza's death in 1879, Peñafrancia had a founding myth, a permanent sanctuary, an established pious practice, the traslación, the fluvial procession, and the patronage of the local principalia. Bishop Campo reported in 1898 that the devotee in 1896 had endowed the sanctuary finally with a large capellania worth 5,000 in gold. Peñafrancia also began to receive an annual subsidy from the bishop, equivalent to 12 masses in a year. By the late 1870s, Peñafrancia had transcended marginality. Despite its peripheral location, the Nuestra Señora de Peñafrancia had acquired the pomp and grandeur of visitation at the local colonial center. By then, John the Evangelist, the patron saint of Nueva Cáceres, had been completely sidelined, with no comparable pageantry associated with his feast day. In 1880, the year after Gainza passed away, an observer described the fluvial procession in these terms: "Never have I seen a similar pompous, majestic, and moving event or is there a similar one written in history?" The author was so moved that he found it difficult to describe this solemn moment involving, quote, an immense crowd that could be seen on both banks of the river, as well as on the Tabuco Bridge. The singing does not stop. The shouts of "Viva la Virgen" increase and crescendo. Now, I have a section here that I will not go into detail for lack of time. That the point also is that this was no longer just a religious tradition. It began to take a civic aspect. People then began to spruce up their homes in case they would have visitors from other parts, from other towns. And they would all decorate the streets with buntings and foliages and palm trees and adornments. And so it would become a very festive atmosphere. So by the late 19th century, we can no longer separate the religious from the civil performance of this festivity. In the meantime, it is worth noting that the fall of Spanish rule in Nueva Cáceres happened on the last day of the Peñafrancia festivities in 1898, when for some reason the observance of the fiesta was moved to September. Corporal Elias Angeles, the native Guardia Civil, had cleverly chosen the late night of Sunday, 18 September 1898, as the day to launch an attack against the Spanish elements in the city. The reason was obviously tactical, since the fiesta, with all of its pomp, was the perfect distraction. There were already rumors that the attack would happen at that time, so much so that Fray Roman Gonzalez, the ecclesiastical governor, exhorted the people in his homily to preserve and uphold peace. Bishop Campo himself had escaped to Spain in April of that year, but there still erupted a battle on that big Calle Real, later renamed Elias Angeles, between the native fighters and the remaining Hispanic elements. The Spanish surrendered on the following Monday, 19 September, through the mediation of Fray Gonzalez. Lest we get distracted, the fact is that the Peñafrancia festivities had become so central for Angeles to use it to end the rule of Catholic Spain. Expanding geographic domain and a movable feast. Sometime in the 1850s, in the Dalit that Grijalvo composed for the Virgin of Peñafrancia, he appeared to have thought of Bicol as a distinct geographic and ethno-linguistic history, whose identity was entangled with Peñafrancia. In the Dalit, as you can see, the beginning and end on the screen, the Virgin was referred to as Señora ng Kabicolan, upon whom the hopes of her people rested. Faced with natural adversities, the Virgin was invoked in the Dalit to bring to Kabicolan peace and tranquility. Finally, the Virgin was requested to hearken to the entire Bicol, who were, quote, her brethren. Now that the Bishop of Nueva Cáceres, whose jurisdiction at that time included the then provinces of Tayabas, now Quezon and Aurora provinces, La Laguna and Nueva Ecija, deliberately used the term Kabicolan, meant that he was using what was perhaps a very flexible, even inchoate term. If Kabicolan was exactly like the region as we know it today, did Grijalvo deliberately exclude the people of Tayabas? Or was Kabicolan malleable enough to include some or all of those areas encompassed by the bishopric? This issue needs further research, but two things are rather certain. First, Kabicolan was not an ecclesiastical unit, but Grijalvo could associate it with the Virgin of Peñafrancia, and which he did. Second, Grijalva's rhetorical strategy in a popular form of literature rather than in an official document was able to discursively reposition Peñafrancia away from complete marginality in a remote visita into the heart of a large geographical domain. Perhaps incipient, Cabicolan was a term with which people from a wide area could begin to identify. The ability of the Virgin of Peñafrancia to serve as the focal point of Cabicolan, however, became palpable in the late 19th century. Spanish writer reported in 1886 that the Peñafrancia in September attracted all sorts of people, quote, "Here gather Spaniards and Indios who came not only from Camarines Sur but from Carimbanire Sorte, but also from Albay, Tayabas, Masbate, and Ticao, from Burias and other provinces. In the 1900s, Freer observed, relatives, friends, and strangers arrived from every portion of Camarines and even from the neighboring provinces of Albay and Sorsogon. They come by banca, baroto, caromata, on horseback, and afoot. Every family, high and low, has its guests. Nueva Caceres thus became the site of a regional pilgrimage, with people from all over the Bicol Peninsula bumping into each other and realizing that they were united geographically and socially by their shared devotion to Peñafrancia. The density of the pilgrims would increase as the means of transportation improved, especially with the formation of the first regional bus company in the Philippines in 1910, the Alatco Bus Company, which could transport the faithful across the peninsula with greater ease. Ostensibly at the instance of the faithful and the clergy, Bishop Arsenio de Campo, an Augustinian, petitioned at the instance of the faithful and the clergy, in 1895, Bishop Arsenio de Campo petitioned the Vatican to declare the Virgin of Peñafrancia as the patrona principal de la ciudad de Nueva Cáceres. This is in 1895. The Vatican granted this request, fixing the date of the feast day of Peñafrancia to the first Sunday of July, allegedly as it had always been, and requiring the major rite of the Mass should be said of the first class. This was the first instance that such a declaration was ever made. In 1895, when the fiesta still took place in September, there was the usual pattern that was followed, but in the next 2 years, 1896, 1897, the fiesta was held in July. Another declaration from the Vatican came in quick succession. In July 1895, the Virgin of Peñafrancia was declared Patrona Celestial, tanto de la ciudad como de todas las diócesis de Cáceres. The Virgin of Peñafrancia was named as the celestial patroness, not only of the city of Nueva Cáceres, but of the entire diocese of Nueva Cáceres. It meant that Peñafrancia was the patron of this large geographical area, but one probably that could not be neatly equated with Cabicolan, because the diocese extended to southern Tagalog. As the 19th century came to a close, the geographic domain of Peñafrancia was still largely the same as that of the 1850s, when Grijalva composed his Dalit that extolled the Señora de Cabicolan. By 1895, however, the title had sort of become official, although strictly speaking, the title pertained to the Diocese of Nueva Cáceres rather than Cabicolan. But Nueva Cáceres itself had become a slippery term, for it could refer to the city, but also to the larger diocese. By 1895, the decree was a pivotal moment, for it asserted Peñafrancia's place as the patron of the city and diocese. However, it would not be until the statue's canonical coronation in 1924 that the Virgin of Peñafrancia would solidify this hegemonic title over the region. In 1910, the Diocese of Lipa was created, and with its establishment, Tayabas was transferred from Nueva Cáceres to the Bishopric of Lipa. The borders of Nueva Cáceres were beginning to coincide with Cabicolan. Now, hailing from Baao, George Barlini Imperial, the first Filipino native to be consecrated a bishop, having been appointed as bishop in December 1905 and passing away in September 1909, Barlin was first appointed as Administrador Apostolic Administrator, but he was the de facto Bishop of Nueva Cáceres since 1903. And in that capacity, he sought the transfer of the fiesta from July to September. And so this was approved by the Vatican. And so it is to Berlin that we owe now the practice of having a fiesta held in September. Berlin was also responsible for the founding of the Asociación de Nuestra Señora de Peñafrancia in 1907, the organization that requested for the canonical coronation of the image in 1919. In organizing this association, Berlin systematized the private sponsorship of the devotion to Peñafrancia, creating an effective alternative to a religious order. The grandeur and pomp and elite entanglements of the Peñafrancia festivities during Berlin's watch as administrator was very obvious. It could be seen in the grandeur of the Procession and the fluvial procession, which I will no longer describe. This is now very crucial. An American bishop amid local elite competition. Berlin's successor in Nueva Cáceres was the Irish-born American priest John Bernard McGinley. And McGinley, whose portrait is here and in the group photo taken in 1910 when he became bishop, is second to the left, seated. McGinley was part of this retinue of 5 priests recruited by Bishop Dennis Doherty from his home Archdiocese of Philadelphia to accompany him to the Bishop of Nueva Segovia in northern Luzon in 1903. McGinley was loaned by Philadelphia to Nueva Segovia for 5 years, and in 1908, he returned to the US. But then he was appointed as rector of the Colegio de Inmaculada Concepcion in Vigan, and then later on, with Doherty's recommendation, McGinley was elected Bishop of Nueva Cáceres in 1910 to succeed Bishop Berlin, because the Vatican was forewarned not to appoint another native bishop. So in his 1915 report to the Holy See, we sense the heart of McGinley. He says he has no enthusiasm for this local devotion. He says, quote, "There's so much devotion here of a kind that revolves around processions, musical concerts, the ringing of bells, the launching of fireworks, and all that sort of thing. But the devotion in spirit and truth, which values more the keeping of God's commandments, being devoted to prayer, hearing masses, and frequently receiving the sacraments of the church. Alas, it flourishes less. Consequently, many fall into vices, and among them into the most harmful of all, luxury, lying, perjury, fraud, and others. And some, though very few, have been deceived by the trickery of ministers and have abandoned the faith." Needless to say, McGinley was not enthusiastic in his first episcopal assignment of 13 years. And at the outset, even Doherty considered Nueva Cáceres as not considered a very prominent diocese. The challenging conditions and boredom compelled McGinley to request to be transferred back to the US in 1923. However, despite McGinley's attitude toward popular piety and his desire to leave the diocese, he warmed up to the idea of the canonical coronation when it was broached to him by the elite-led Asociación de Nuestra Señora de Peñafrancia. As bishop, McGinley was at the center of competing factions in his diocese, both among the laity and the clergy. To refuse the request of the elites of Naga would have been bad policy for an institution that relied on the donations of the faithful for its upkeep and survival. He thus, quote, "cordially approved such a pious and holy idea," and he invited the faithful to donate, quote, "their money and jewelries to fund the petition and see it through the Vatican bureaucracy." We could ask, what compelled the elite association to petition the bishop for this holy and pious idea? It is worth noting that up to that point, only La Naval de Manila had been canonically crowned in 1907, amid much controversy. The Virgin of Antipolo was a more central Marian image, but it was only canonically crowned in 1926. 2 years after Peñafrancia. Even stranger is the fact that the Virgin of Peña de Francia in Salamanca would only be canonically crowned in 1952. Given this context, it was highly unusual for the Virgin of Peñafrancia to be canonically crowned even without large endowments. That the Asociación in Nueva Cáceres requested the coronation in 1919 could only be regarded as a reaction to a trigger. That trigger appears to be the rise of a competing Marian image and devotion within the Bicol Peninsula, namely the Nuestra Señora de Salvación of Horoan Tiwi Albay. In 1919, under Bishop McGinley's watch, the peripheral ermita, and you can see even now how small that church is. This peripheral ermita of Nuestra Señora de Salvación in Horoan was canonically erected as a parish, emerging from its peripheral status quite quickly. In contrast, the Santuario of Peñafrancia in Naga was not a parish and did not have this canonical status. I will not go into the details of this history, but there were conflicts between Tiwi and the Ermita of Horoan over the ownership of the image of the Virgin. But after a long and arduous process of negotiation that began in 1917, it was finally decided in 1918 that the full ownership of the image of Salvacion be awarded to the Barrio of Horoan. Now, to further secure the barrio's possession of this image, McGinley elevated the humble and peripheral ermita to a fully fledged canonical parish in 1919. In just a couple of years, Horoan was transformed from a small ermita into a pilgrim site for the province. All these developments in Tiwi must have reached the ears of the elites in Naga. That the request made by the Asociación for the coronation of Peñafrancia happened almost simultaneously as the establishment of Horoan cannot be mere coincidence. The meteoric rise of Horoan and Salvacion from obscurity must certainly have caused suspicion and a sense of insecurity among the Naga elites. If Horoan principales could do this, why could the Naga elites not do it also? After all, they were far wealthier. Naga had to assert its precedence in the region by achieving a feat that a poor and peripheral parish like Horoan could only dream of. The coronation was that kind of assertion of superiority. The canonical coronation, coaxing a regional act. The declaration from the Vatican on the canonical coronation says that it could be done for either antiquity or the nobility of miracles. It meant that the image must have a storied reputation. It must be exemplary and therefore central, not peripheral. When the Principales of Nueva Cáceres requested that the image of Peñafrancia was crowned, they were asking the Holy See not only to recognize its antiquity and miraculous fame, but also its centrality in the life of the region. Indeed, as Bishop McGinley noted, Peñafrancia, quote, has captivated since olden times the devotion of all the Bicolano people. Of course, that's not entirely accurate. Curiously, the decree issued by the Vatican on the 13th of May, 1920, did not mention that Peñafrancia was to have the official patronage of a Cabicolan. It merely stated that the image was, quote, venerated with deep devotion and religiosity by all the inhabitants of the city and neighboring towns, unquote. Of course, in 1895, the Virgin had been declared as the patroness of the entire Diocese of Nueva Cáceres, and by 1920, the diocese had been limited to the geographic domains of what is now Bicol. However, the Vatican decree of coronation did not bind her as the patroness of Cabicolan. It was only in the popular imagination, especially in the coronation hymn, that we began to think of her as the patroness of Cabicolan. Officially, as far as 1920 document is concerned, the canonical coronation only solidified the previous declaration of her patronage of the diocese. In people's mind, however, It was nothing short of enthroning her as the celestial queen of Bicolandia. Amid the silence of this Vatican document as to the Virgin's patronage, local clergy and the Naga elites worked deliberately to promote Peñafrancia as patrona del Bicol. They had to capture popular sentiment and imagination to think and imagine Peñafrancia, and by extension, the city of Nueva Cáceres, now Naga, as it was beginning to be called by then, as the center of regional life. Soon after the association requested for the canonical coronation, McGinley immediately devised plans to raise funds for the occasion. The estimated amount needed for the coronation was 60,000 pesos, $30,000, to which the enthusiastic attendees of McGinley's first meeting on 28th of December 1919 gave a subscription of 5,000 pesos as a start-up fund. McKinley was hopeful to hold the coronation in September 1920. So he directed the parish priests to establish committees in each parish tasked with collecting funds. To the bishop's office at the end of every month, with the bishop acting as the overall treasurer. The names of donors would be published in the monthly diocesan paper, a pattern already self-evident. However, McKinley's desire for the coronation in September 1920 was frustrated because of the lack of funds. The coronation would take place only in September 1924, which McGinley himself announced in his pastoral letter of despedida, as he was by that time already elected as the new bishop of Monterey Fresno in California. McGinley therefore had done much of the groundwork for everything that transpired in 1924 before he left for the US. No less than the diocese's Filipino Vicar General and Administrator Francisco Reyes indicated in a couple of his missives the hurdle of forming a regional consciousness around the coronation. Reyes's unspoken task was to drill into the minds of the Bicolano faithful that it was not an event exclusive to Naga, but one that involved the entire Bicolandia. He had been appointed to the post at McGinley's departure and was therefore tasked with overseeing the big festivities that were in preparation long before September 1924. In his first circular as a leader of the diocese in July 1924, Reyes urged the faithful of the entire diocese to participate in a peregrinación mariana, a Marian pilgrimage to Naga. All the previous pilgrimages to Naga had been done privately. Reyes insisted that on this occasion of the coronation, each parish should send a delegation as evidence of collective effort. The reason was to bodily represent as much as possible in Naga the entirety of the region. The reason, therefore, he said, this coronation is the work of the Bicol region. Como esta coronación es obra de la región bicolana. He kept underscoring this point. Reyes directed all curates to send to Naga a girl not less than 8 years old and not more than 12 years old to be dressed as a little angel and to stand at the stage for the coronation. These angels would collectively represent the entire region during the coronation. Reyes was aware of the difficulty of traveling to Naga from other parts of Bicol, but he exhorted his priests that such pilgrimage should not be treated as a difficult thing to achieve. Therefore, to ease mobility and incentivize people to attend the canonical coronation, Reyes announced that the Manila Railroad Company had agreed to grant a 32% reduction in round-trip railroad tickets from the 15th to the 24th of September. Religious dignitaries from Manila also traveled on the railway to attend the coronation. In the last appeal for donations that he issued in July 1924, Reyes lamented that funds were still inadequate and he could only cover nominal expenses. Again, he harped on the idea, this is the work of the Bicol region in order to raise more funds. From these statements, one could gather that the attitude of both clergy and laity beyond the city of Naga showed a lack of enthusiasm. The tone of Reyes's letters suggests that he was responding to those who did not share in his zeal for a regional consciousness centered around Peñafrancia. Reyes's real challenge was to promote the idea that the coronation and Peñafrancia were relevant to all of Bicolandia, not just Naga. His specific instructions for an organized pilgrimage and a visual representation with a flock of angels were efforts to catapult Peñafrancia and Naga to the center of the region. Now, finally, the canonical coronation of the Nuestra Señora de Peñafrancia took place on the 20th of September, 1924, with bishops and religious personages from Manila and other parts of the country in attendance. It was later on said that over 150,000 pilgrims descended upon Naga. On the day of the coronation, the venue was full of, quote, pilgrims from all towns of the center, unquote. It was, according to Domingo Abella, a sea of teeming humanity reaching as far as the eyes could see. The traslación was held on Friday, the 12th of September, and the novena commenced in the cathedral. On the following Thursday, 18 September, the public festivities began at dawn with a band of musicians going around the city and bombshells exploding with a torch parade in the late afternoon. The Triduum also began in the afternoon of Thursday. On Friday, the day also began with a band and revelries at dawn. And in the afternoon, the musicians were at the station to welcome trainloads of pilgrims who assembled at the Plaza Rizal, whence they marched in procession to the cathedral, each delegation bearing the standard of their parish. Held in the Plaza del Seminario, the large open space fronting the cathedral, the ceremony was held in the afternoon of Saturday, on the last day of the novena. At the head of the procession from the cathedral to the nearby coronation site, which started after 4 p.m., at the head were the standards of the pilgrims of the majority of the more than 100 parishes that constitute this diocese, quote unquote. By implication, there was, quote, a minority of parishes that did not send or could not afford to send a delegation. Bicolan was not complete even at this peak moment. Nonetheless, Reyes' design for the angelic girls was fulfilled. The crowns were paid for by public subscription, and during the ceremony, the crowns were carried by the padrinos of the coronation, Doña Antonia Viuda de Pado and Manuel Crisini, the provincial governor of Camarines Sur. In a moment of solemn silence, apostolic delegate to the Philippines, Monsignor Guglielmo Piani, put the crown on the image of the Virgin Peñafrancia, decked in full regalia, while the Archbishop of Manila, Michael J.O. Doherty, crowned the child Jesus. The silence was pierced by the ringing of church bells, and accompanied by an orchestra, the people raised their voices in chorus to sing the coronation hymn. Then the procession from the cathedral leading to the fluvial embarkation began, passing through streets decorated with flags, flowers, arches, and branches. In the procession were the religious dignitaries, the standards of the pilgrim parishes, and the girls in angelic costumes. Also conspicuous were the veterans of the revolution, decked in gala uniform and in correct formation. Note that the Consul of Spain to the Philippines also attended. Peñafrancia was a powerful symbol that could unite groups on different sides of the political fence, but it also signified that after all, Peñafrancia was not Spanish, but rather an indigenous devotion. It seemed to favor the side of the revolutionaries, and the revolutionaries could march down in the procession down Calle Real on the way to Tabuco, on the same street where they waged a major battle. The same street that witnessed the fierce battle could now witness the procession to the fluvial procession. What a vindication for the successful uprising against Spain that in Naga was staged on the feast day of the Virgin of Peñafrancia. The fluvial procession itself, which started later than usual, was a grand spectacle, with the people watching attentively on the river banks. The river was, quote, illumined by hundreds of torches, whose brightness alternated with the thousands of rockets that soared through a swift flower of fire, while the flares cast a yellowish hue on the landscape. Rather than reality, it seemed more like the fancy of a dreamer's imagination in the fantastical decoration of an oriental tale, unquote. The same observer noted that back in the shrine, the people once more sang in the coronation's hymn with profound mysticism. Thus, the canonical coronation, was an Oriental, not a Spanish colonial narrative, a mystical experience with the Virgin of Peñafrancia and the devotion to it being truly an indigenous innovation. And if there is one thing from the coronation 100 years ago that has endured the test of time, it is the iconic Resuene Vibrante. The hymno a Nuestra Señora de Peñafrancia was a crucial factor in solidifying a regional identity that was then in the process of being imagined. The hymn was sung after the novena, beginning on the Thursday leading to the coronation and the coronation day itself. In 1880, songs were already being reportedly sung by the faithful during the Peñafrancia festivities, but we don't know what they were singing. Sometime before September 1924, the diocese held a contest, and the winning song was that by the Vincentian professor at the Seminario, Maximo Huguera, and this was Huguera's hymno that won. Huguera, of course, wrote in Spanish and not in Bicol. He was a Vincentian who arrived in the Philippines in 1916. Before the reforms of the Second Vatican Council, we should note, there was no solid practice of congregational singing in the Roman Catholic liturgy. Congregational hymn singing, complete with hymnals, was introduced to the Philippines in the early 20th century by American Protestant missionaries who introduced the practice here. But this was not the practice in the Catholic Church. And yet we find in the Resuene Vibrante congregational singing, especially in the coro. Given this innovation, Huguera structured his work in antiphonal form with a memorable chorus that formed the most important part of the hymn. Since the coro general was meant for the people who spoke little to no Spanish, it had to contain a minimal number of Spanish words. Unlike the choir's chorus, one found in the coro general the critical terms that needed dissemination: patrona, Bicol, reina, región. In terms of literary style, it lacked luster, but Huguera sought to help the faithful internalize the idea of Peñafrancia as patrona del Bicol, so he had to be direct and less florid. And once it was out there, the text was susceptible to reappropriation by the mass of unlettered, illiterate, or little educated people. And people were able to fish out those words: patrona, Bicol, reina, región. The coro general as the response of the people, as a climactic, exhilarating, and emotionally charged theme without being overly complex. Thus, the hymn Patrona del Bicol became resonant in Bicolano popular consciousness, even though it was never an official title granted by the Vatican. And I just end this very long lecture, and I hope you are still awake. After this long lecture, you deserve a good break. I just like to ask, are we in this 100 years anniversary consciously remembering the coronation with a regional dimension? And how regional is it? Or are we just back in Nueva Caceres of yore? Thank you very much. Diyos mabarlos po sa Indogabos.